But yeah, so we wanted to, as we said, bust some brain myths today, and we thought there's no better way to bust some brain myths than bring in the brain myth buster in chief. That is your new official title, Andrew,
Wonderful.
our CEO, actual
Just
potato.
trying to dip the name Andrew, aren't you? And just give me a
Yeah,
different
I
name.
guess.
Mythbuster in
So
chief. I'll go with that.
we're going to try and bust three quick myths today, and these are probably myths that you've heard. You might even believe them, and not, and that's okay. That's what we're here to do. We want to just bust them and talk about what, There's sometimes a little element of truth to these myths, and that's why they catch on. But also talk about what's actually happening in your brains, and then how we can apply that to our lives to make them slightly better, to save the world one brain at a time, as we always do. So I want to start with a classic internet brain myth, which is that we have two brains actually. Didn't know if you know this. We actually have two brains, and one of them is a left brain, and one of them is a right brain. So if you are left-brained, you are more logical, analytical, and if you are right-brained, you are more creative and you're more maybe expressive, a bit more artistic. So, you know, what do we think about this myth, guys? What do we think?
Yeah, exactly, exactly. We
Thumbs
can we
down
can
from
move
Andy.
we can move on.
That's it.
Yeah,
Okay, now moving on to
yeah,
the next myth.
yeah,
Nonsense.
Exactly.
yeah.
Um,
Okay, so
so
it arises, doesn't it, from the fact that do have two hemispheres, absolutely, and they are connected by a big highway called the corpus callosum, which is a big bundle of neurons that connects both halves. And the misconception comes from the fact that there is localization in the cortex. What I mean is there are bits of the brain that habitually do things. Like, for example, language processing centers tend to be kind of down on the kind of right hand side of the back behind the ear, that kind of thing. And then other logic circuits are over on the left. This is kind of where people have seen
mm,
neurons firing in brain scans, and then they
yes,
begin to localize the sort of behaviors. But what we also know from brains is if areas of the brain are damaged, some areas, other areas of the brain can kind of pick up that kind of that role. Not completely. It's kind of very nuanced, but the best way to understand the brain, the only way to understand the brain, is that it's a connected network sending information all over the blinking place. And we are not left or right brained. In fact, I
yes.
was listening to a neuroscientist the other day who, that believes that we are left right and has written a whole book about it. And the problem is people dine out on this stuff and they end up, believing stuff that is no longer true
Yeah.
because they've ended up nailing their kind of economic survivability to it. So, if you've written a book about left brain, right brainness, you've got to keep saying it's true even when it's not true. And that's
Yeah.
that's the trouble with science, because science itself is beautiful in the sense that it will update itself, but because it's run by humans, humans are biased
Mm.
and they end up kind of
And if you've got
believing
a
a
certain
bunch of
view of something, you're going to stick to that view, even if 10 years ago that was the a new wave of exciting. Oh, this is very new, a new way of thinking about it. But when that view gets updated again, people are less, that your brain doesn't like change in even understanding how the brain works. So it's not going to want to accept a new model, especially if you've built a lot of your life and your understanding of yourself around a certain previous model.
Yeah,
But
exactly. I mean, the way to think about it is, basically, it's the way science updates is the way the brain updates. Effectively, what happens is science updates because anomalies occur. So the data doesn't match suddenly the model. And then because there are a bunch of tenured professors saying, no, 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 that's wrong, that's wrong, eventually the anomalies get so enormous that the whole edifice collapses and a
like an
new model
avalanche.
has to be built. Yeah, and that's what happens in brains as well.
Yeah.
So, just very quickly, in 30 seconds flat, if I just do the Big Bang from the steady state version of the universe to the Big Bang. So the 1950s, the common model of cosmology was that the universe was steady state. It was not expanding. There was no Big Bang. And then they were doing some kind of searching for information across this cosmos, looking for kind of information and to support the steady state theory. And they had this annoying white noise on the radio telescopes. They were like, blinking out, that is annoying. What is that? So they went to the radio telescope and found it was covered in pigeon poo. And they thought, blinking out, the pigeon poo is causing interference, which is stopping us getting the data we need for the steady state. So they spent thousands of pounds cleaning the pigeon poo off this radio telescope. And they then ran the experiment again. The punchline is the hiss was still there, and ultimately the hiss turns out to be evidence of the Big Bang. The hiss is the cosmic background radiation, which the Big Bang theory, which was a very small theory at the time, which didn't have many advocates, said if there's a Big Bang, you'll find evidence of it in the universe. Every direction you'll find this hiss, about 3 degrees of radiation, you'll find it. So literally, it flipped within about 8 years, and the whole thing went to Big Bang. But that's literally what happens. Brains get stuck in
Yeah.
believing stuff because they've invested so much time in a model. Um,
And I think what's so interesting about, this myth and the ones we're going to talk about the rest of the podcast, I'm in coaching mode, is that there's an element of truth, like you said, like certain activities are localized to certain parts of the brain, but it's just basically a lot of these myths are just far too simplistic for how amazingly beautiful and but complicated and confusing the brain is. Like it's not as simple as this part does all of this and that's all it does. This part does all of that and that's all it does. And if you took that bit out, you wouldn't have that ability anymore. It's just basically a lot more complicated than that. So yes, you do not have two distinct versions of yourself, two different brains that you can access my creative part, because you see those quizzes all the time, or I do anyway. Like my tailored cookies always send me like these little quizzes like, are you left-brained or right-brained? And it's like people use this stuff as excuses. Oh, I've heard this in this work is like, oh, I'm actually left-brained. It's like, okay, what does that
yeah,
mean?
no,
What the heck does
exactly
that
right.
mean?
I think you're absolutely right. Everything is much more complicated than it appears. Like a table appears to be solid, but actually a table is 99% empty space. The only reason it appears to be solid is electrons are spinning so fast around the nucleus that it appears to be solid. So everything is much more complicated than it
It's
appears.
supposed to be trying to make things slightly less confusing, but I feel like we're making big more.
But that's the point, isn't it? The point is it is confusing. The point is this stuff isn't simple and easy. And I think just fundamentally the whole idea of this myth busting, people struggle with because people get your backs up. If you believe something wholeheartedly, you do not like to be told that you are wrong. It puts you on the
Yeah,
defensive. It makes you put
totally.
you. I'll get my fist. I'm not wrong. I'm right. I wholeheartedly believe in my beliefs, and to move away from a core belief system that you might hold because it is fundamentally wrong, people don't enjoy that. That's uncomfortable. We don't like to face that. So it's important that we all have a bit within us that it's okay to be wrong. It's okay to be proved wrong. So let's just not get so defensive and actually open ourselves up to new possibilities and new science and what's it telling us.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah.